Russia has ordered a daily truce, but the shelling continues in Eastern Ghouta. Fresh fighting reported by the UN in the rebel-held enclave near Damascus, with, on the one hand, claims by independent monitors of Syrian government warplanes and helicopter strikes, and on the other, the Russians accusing the rebels in that enclave near Damascus of carrying out a ground assault. The accusations as well is that neither side is letting civilians out. After the sieges of Homs and Aleppo, another grim endgame unfolds in a civil war marked by staggering brutality. It's worth stopping to ask why, to examine who's fighting who in Eastern Ghouta, and what will be the cost of another scorched earth victory for Bashar al-Assad. Earlier, the French foreign minister was in Moscow, France among the nations pushing for an uninterrupted 30-day ceasefire. That was the vote over the weekend at the UN Security Council. What's the Kremlin strategy? Is Vladimir Putin winning the war or bogged down in a mess that he now owns? And how should the West respond? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at what the UN has called hell on earth, and with us to talk about it from the Jordanian capital, Rachel Sider. She's the Syria policy advisor for Norwegian Refugee Council, one of the aid organizations that's been most front and center. Thank you for being with us.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Also with us, former UN General Dominique Trinquant. Always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. And a pleasure to welcome to the studio political scientist Rula Jibril, visiting professor at the University of Miami, usually based in Rome, today in Paris. Thank you for having me. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate. The lull was, well, I guess you could say scant. It's only day one, says Moscow. Whether the truce can work will depend, in the words of the Kremlin spokesperson, on how, quote, the terrorist groups behave. Owen Barnell has more.
A 5-hour break for those trapped in Eastern Ghouta through a daily humanitarian truce. Yet here at this border stop, shelling echoes over the empty Wafadine crossing point. Manned by military, there are no signs of anyone leaving the enclave. And despite the truce, shelling and mortar attacks on crossing points have been reported.
Putin's few hours of truce in Eastern Ghouta, which began at 9 a.m. this morning, there have been at least 2 deaths in Mizraba and Duma. The ground bombardments continue in the cities of Arasta, Mizraba, and Duma, with planes also used to bombard civilians.
Russia's fragile truce is far from the 30-day ceasefire that the UN Security Council resolution called for on Saturday. The Red Cross declared they were unable to deliver any aid without security guarantees from all sides, and questioned the 5 hours as simply not enough for aid deliveries.
It's never enough. It's not enough at all. Basically, because we are crossing the front line between one side and the other. Also, logistically, it takes a lot of time to load the trucks. So 5 hours, I'm afraid, there is very little we can achieve in such a time.
Syria's regime has intensified bombardment of the territory in recent days. Some 400,000 people are trapped in the rebel-held enclave, surrounded by government forces. More than 550 civilians, almost a quarter of them children, have been killed since February 18th.
Rachel Sider, your reaction to what we heard from that representative of the International Committee of the Red Cross, that 5 hours is not enough anyways to get aid in?
Absolutely. So what we're seeing is that very short window of a cessation of hostilities, one, is contrary to the very essence of the new Security Council resolution, which was passed this weekend by the Security Council. And secondly, that aid agencies have been prevented from reaching those who are most in need with life-saving assistance for weeks now. So that 5-hour window is too short for those agencies to be able to ramp up the assistance, to get their teams in order, to be able to gain access to some of these hard-to-reach areas where civilians have been hiding and sheltering from violence for a number of days now. They've been without basic services, medical assistance, and attention. And that's going to take a long time for us to be able to reach those people and to be able to provide for those critical needs.
Do we know how many civilians are there? How many people are we talking about?
So we estimate that there's nearly 400,000 people that are located inside Eastern Ghouta who've been facing high levels of siege for nearly 4 years now, in addition to ongoing escalation of violence, particularly in the past few weeks.
Particularly in the past few weeks, do you have teams on the ground who are telling you what the situation on the outskirts of Eastern Ghouta?
So we're in close coordination with colleagues based in Damascus who report that there has been ongoing shelling in the area. They've been on the receiving end of a number of mortars, up to hundreds a day, in communities inside Damascus that, again, have been overstretched in terms of accommodating for the displaced populations that have sought safety and refuge in areas in Damascus, and report that there are aid agencies and partners on the ground in Eastern Ghouta that continue to struggle to provide and meet for the most basic needs of the 400 civilians that remain besieged in that enclave.
We're going to try to go now to Eastern Ghouta. Noor Adam is there, and he's been sending out videos from there. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24. I guess the question is, how has your day been? What have you seen?
Today in Eastern Ghouta, there were more than 15 airstrikes hit the building and the town in Ghouta. There is no ceasefire at all. When Russia annoying about the ceasefire like for 5 hours, that is not true, because the Russian warplanes and the Assad warplanes did not leave the sky of Ghouta and did not stop hitting every building and every town in Eastern Ghouta. They target the shelter, they target the hospital, and they target the ambulance.
How are you getting out in terms of getting food, getting water? How does it work?
Their families here did not eat anything. There are a lot of lack of medicine, and there lack and there are a lot of shortage of medical supplies, and target hospital. I mean, when people trade from injured, they target the hospital. The bomb did not stop. They target the shelter. They target the clinic. I mean, it's like hell on the ground.
Noor Adam, many thanks for joining us. We'll try to cross over to you a little bit later on. The apologies for the poor connection there. Your reaction, General Trinquant, to how this is all unfolding, what there's been at least 500 civilians they believe killed in the last week?
It's exactly the same scenario as it's happened in Aleppo or in Homs a few years ago. The population is really kept hostage from both sides. I mean, from Bashar al-Assad, of course, but also from the rebels in the city. And so for Bashar al-Assad, it's very important to take this part because it's very close from Damascus. And so you've got to take that, because without taking that, you've got no security in Damascus. So for him, it's very important. For the rebels, it's very important, because with the population, they can put pressure on Damascus. Without the population, they've got no more weapons against the regime.
How do we explain the fact that there's been this enclave that's been there now for, 4 years?
Yeah, it's interesting, because for last year, in fact, Damascus, with the help of the Russian air reconquest, almost all Syria, and you've got still two big pockets, which is one very close from Damascus and the other very close from the Turkish border. And what's happened is that because it was very difficult, it was the first attempt to throw out Bashar al-Assad was coming from Ghouta, and so it was the first attempt in 5 years ago, and so the Syrian government has managed to keep this enclave out from the fight which was happening elsewhere. But now it's the end for him. He wants to finish the job, if I must say, from Bashar al-Assad, and so he had to take this enclave, because without that, he is not the real master of Syria, because Damascus can receive rocket from the rebels in this area.
When you saw over the weekend the United Nations Security Council approving this resolution and Russia signing on to it, calling for this 30-day uninterrupted ceasefire, what did you think at the time, Rula?
I thought nothing will happen. The real ruler of Syria today is not Bashar al-Assad. It's Mr. Vladimir Putin, who decided to intervene in this conflict. Look, today more than any other day, with this massacre, with this human travesty and catastrophe that is the shame of our generation, by the way. And if I remember, my generation reflected, how did we allow the Holocaust to happen? How did Europe allow the world allow the Holocaust to happen? We found the answer in Syria. It's the total moral and illegal ability to intervene. After Rwanda, after Kosovo, the world came together and made a resolution. That resolution was called the responsibility to protect civilians. We relinquished our basically responsibility in this. And we have 3-4 phenomena coming out of it. One, the refugees, radicalization, whether European Muslims or even Muslims around the world. And we have a tyrant and a thug, and they basically decided from day one, 2011, I was inside Syria. I was one of the first journalists going inside Syria. Bashar al-Assad had a non-violent revolution, and it's good to remember always. Those people stood up in the streets. They didn't ask for regime change. They asked for reforms. They asked for dignity. They asked for social justice. And they also asked for opportunity and freedom. And some political process that include their voices. Exactly like the French people in this country centuries ago stood up and they asked liberté, fraternité, and égalité. The same principles. However, Bashar al-Assad decided to answer with one language. Release barrel bombs, basically on his own people, turning this civil war into a war on civilians, paving the way, as JFK said, when you make non-violent revolutions impossible, you will make violent revolution inevitable. That is what happened in Syria. This is what we're seeing.
On that point, General Trinquant, the brutality of it, how do you explain it?
I mean, war is brutal. It's hell. Of course, war, it's hell. The problem is that during the first years, after the Pacific demonstration in Syria, nobody do anything. After 2 years, suddenly the Russians decided to support Bashar al-Assad. Right. But on the Western side, nobody do anything.
I agree.
I mean, they provide weapons to different bands of people, and we were not exactly identified. And so after that, you can say they are terrorists or they are not terrorists. It's a bit difficult.
You operated in the former Yugoslavia. Yeah. There, where the animosity is great, and we had a genocide there at one point, in Srebrenica, most notably. Nonetheless, all parties in the end agreed to at least a cold peace.
No. The scenario is always the same. If you want to stop war, you've got to make war. You've got to fight. And the problem is that the Western country didn't decide to fight. So in Yugoslavia, when it stopped, I was there in 95, when we decided the Serbs are the bad guy, so they will be defeated. And that was a decision. You can discuss the discussion, you can say right or wrong, but it was a discussion. When a crisis starts like that, you've got to stop it very quickly. Because after 5 or 6 years, now you've got these people in Ghouta, nobody controls them, really. They have been fighting for 5 years. They are making money over the people inside Ghouta.
General, there are civilians that are being hammered. Rightly so, you mentioned that hundreds of thousands of people were killed.
Sarajevo was the same.
Bashar al-Assad there's symptoms, so you're talking about symptoms, and there's a disease. The disease is called tyranny and Bashar al-Assad. And symptoms coming out of that are called ISIS and Al-Qaeda and all of these. And sadly, tyranny and terror live in symbiosis. They thrive on each other. And there's one scenario where we didn't need to do war, actually, General. And I understand from your standpoint as a general, war is the language some people speak. But there's one scenario, South Africa. There was sanctions, harsh sanctions that economically crippled a country and forced the parties. And Leclerc was a white president that paved the way for reconciliation. We did not even do that in Syria. We basically allowed this tyrant to get away with murder and with war crimes.
Rachel Sider,
focus on the, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to ask you.
I just want to say, just to focus on the immediate, situation that we're facing with right now, we do have an opportunity to return to the question of an immediate and sustained 30-day ceasefire. And I think that's an opportunity that's brought parties back to the table and is encouraging all parties to the conflict to put down their weapons, to end sieges, and to enable basic humanitarian access to those who are most in need. And it's an opportunity, I think, for us to rally back around the table for Security Council member states to begin to monitor what could be a potential cessation in hostilities and lead towards a hopefully longer term and more durable ceasefire that can bring us right on the track that we need to be, which is an end to human suffering for the 13.1 million Syrians who are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance across the country.
Reporting in The Independent, Rachel, Patrick Coburn spoke with one resident of Eastern Ghouta who said that the rebels wouldn't let him out, and that even if they would let him out, he was trying to bring his family to safety. He was fearful that once he got to the other side, the hostility is such in Damascus that their lives would be in danger on the other side as well.
Precisely. So from our experience and what we've seen in other parts of Syria, whether that's Aleppo or other cases where we've seen either forced displacement or evacuation initiatives, what we've seen is that these unilateral initiatives are often extremely harmful and dangerous to civilians and end up putting them at even greater risk. And what we're concerned about in particular is the likelihood of the separation of families for those who are attempting to flee, the use of civilians as human shields, as we've seen in other instances of civilians seeking to flee what are active offensives, ground offensives in cities such as Raqqa or Aleppo, and other instances when we see civilians that don't have very many options of places where they can flee to. And that writing off of options for relocation and access to safety is a critical concern right now in the case that we do reach a point where civilians can flee. But I think at this point, until we can't begin to conceive of evacuation or civilians accessing safety outside of Eastern Ghouta until we have a sustainable and legitimate ceasefire, and we haven't been able to see that. These interim periods of a few hours of maybe a reduction in violence is not enough to enable civilians to access those pathways.
Rachel, we're going to pick up on that point. We have to take a very quick break. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're talking on what should have been the first day of a Moscow-imposed 5-hour truce. It didn't go to plan with the shelling continuing. Reportedly, both sides trading accusations on that score. With us from the Jordanian capital, Rachel Sider, Syria policy advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council. Welcome back as well to former UN General Dominique Trinquant and to Rula Jibril, a visiting professor at the University of Miami. We were just talking before the break, Rachel Sider was mentioning how the 30-day ceasefire can only be a prelude, the 30-day ceasefire that's been touted by the United Nations and that Security Council resolution can only be the prelude to real concerted action on all sides when it comes to evacuations. We're joined from Eastern Ghouta again by Noor Adam, who's there. Noor, is it possible to leave Eastern Ghouta?
We are here in Eastern Ghouta. We wake up in the morning on the sound of warplanes where it hit the building and the towns and the village. I mean, the Security Council voted for a ceasefire in Eastern Ghouta for 13 days, but that is not happening. The Russian warplanes and the warplanes did not stop bomb every town and every village in Eastern Ghouta.
Under what conditions would you be accepting to leave Eastern Ghouta? How would you? What do you want to do?
We will never leave. This is our home. It's our right to live here. Why we live to humiliated and live in a camp? This is our home, and here when we are growing up, and here when we're raising our children, and here that's all of my love of the people here. That is our life here. It's our right in our home. How we can give him for like a mass murder like Putin and Bashar Assad. I mean, he's used a chemical attack on the civilians in Ghouta. 2 days ago, he's used a chemical attack, chlorine gas, and Shayfonia town, and killed one child and 16 other people suffocated from this chlorine gas.
Rachel Sider, on the question of the chemical attacks, have you had corroboration of recent attacks?
We've heard several reports which are confirming that, but from our side, what we are concerned about is that there isn't enough medical assistance or adequate medical facilities to be able to address the needs of those who've been affected by the violence, whether it's chemical attacks, aerial bombardment, shelling, other acts of violence which have been highly detrimental to the civilian population and have rendered a lot of medical facilities inactive or inaccessible at this point.
You were talking just before the break, Rachel, about how the 30-day ceasefire is the prelude to all. As you can see, though, there's a complete lack of trust on both sides. What would the 30-day ceasefire achieve?
Well, I think it would be an indication that we can get some commitments to have all parties to the conflict lay down their arms, lift the siege, which has been imposed on Eastern Ghouta for over 4 years now, and enable life-saving humanitarian assistance. So for us, it's really important to see that the entire UN Security Resolution that was passed this weekend, Resolution 2401, is implemented. And part of that is a 30-day truce, but that's only a fraction of what we'd like to see happen in the next coming days. And most importantly, it's important that humanitarian agencies from Damascus are granted the permissions they need to be able to access the populations that have been without life-saving humanitarian assistance for weeks now.
Granted the permission by who?
By the Syrian government, effectively. So that permission is very difficult to obtain, and you have UN convoys, trucks that have been equipped with food, shelter materials, medicines, which have been ready to go for several weeks now. They've applied for permissions from the government, and that has yet to be granted, and they're ready to go. So what we're looking to do is to see that full implementation of the Security Council resolution and to have Security Council member states put pressure to make sure that that access is enabled.
Okay, so the need for permission, that 5-hour-a-day truce, which is a far cry from the uninterrupted 30-day ceasefire that the Security Council has asked for in its weekend resolution. But the French Foreign Minister says it's nonetheless a start. Jean-Yves Le Drian in Moscow earlier.
The announcement by the Russian Defense Minister that the opening of humanitarian corridors will be possible for 5 hours a day. It's progress. More must be done, because a ceasefire should last the entire day, not just half a day. But we acknowledge this progress, and we hope it will continue, and that the actions and decisions of the main players on respecting the ceasefire can build on this opening in order to extend it.
Rula Jibril?
Look, I hope the foreign minister, and I truly believe that France more than ever can play a role. America has relinquished its leadership position in the world, not only in the Middle East. Our president in America is tweeting. He's very busy with his scandals. He has no time. And clearly he's not interested. Russia...
Hang on, but you say that, but the United States nonetheless has its 2,000 military advisors in the northeast of Syria.
Yeah, but de facto...
And they used air power when the others got too close a couple of weeks back.
They do it on basically what they call the rebels and ISIS. Their agenda is to decimate any radical group. They don't have any agenda to confront Assad or, rightly so, the Russians. However, we saw with Hariri and the crisis between Hariri and basically when he was kidnapped by the Saudis, we saw how the Russians, how the French president played a major role in that crisis and thwarted what was about to happen, which is a war, basically. I think France, with the right advisors, they can play a major role in exercising leverage over Syria through Moscow to stop the humanitarian catastrophe.
Do you agree, General Tanko?
Yes, I agree. The problem is that the current government is just trying to do its best, as the previous government has done nothing in Syria. France has a very strong link with Lebanon, of course, but had in the history a very strong role with Syria and have many links in Syria. Several years ago, we decided to close the embassy, to close any link with the Syrian government, so it was impossible. So now, you're right, it's through Russia that we've got to do that, because the only one, even if we don't agree with our policy, the only one who has a policy in Syria are the Russians.
So what leverage do you have over Russia, General?
Sorry?
You said we have to do more, and I agree with you. What are you doing? I understand blaming the other government. It's easy, but these are nice talking points. But what are you doing in terms of how we are negotiating with the Russian and pushing them to stop this humanitarian catastrophe?
You've seen Mr. Le Drian, who is in Moscow. You've seen a resolution voted last Saturday, where the French, of course, P5 and the Security Council have done its job. So the French government is doing its best. What I'm saying is best is very difficult when you've been absent from this area for years.
But when we saw that U.S. strike a few weeks back, the Syrians backed off at that point. And we were speaking at the time with political scientists who said that if the U.S. does get more involved, it would change the equation.
Yeah, of course, but from the start, I mean, 6 years ago, if the U.S., if the French, if the British, if all these Western countries have done something, we will not be at this stage. The problem, I'm not talking about the history of the crisis, I'm talking about the crisis where it is now and what we can do now. And there is a resolution which was voted on Saturday, and as it was clearly said, to open corridor in order for the people either to get out or to stay, because we have heard that they want to stay, to provide food and to provide help is very useful. The problem is that the ceasefire is played by two sides, by the by the Syrian government side, but also by the rebels. If one of the other wants to fight, then you've got no ceasefire. And that's exactly where we are now. And so the pressure must be put on the Syrian government to allow the convoys to get in, and then you've got to check that the rebels are not fighting at the time when the convoys are getting in.
And that's why you have actually to have negotiators. And that's why when you have Russia, who basically took the side of Bashar al-Assad, you have to have other negotiators and diplomats. And this is what Europe is great about. I was raised in Italy for a long time. And our diplomats, who were European diplomats, not only spoke Arabic, they have connections with the whole Maghreb and the Middle East, and they managed to thwart many crises in the 80s and the 90s. However, today, with all due respect to some of the governments we have in Europe, they are so detached from, you have an immigrant community that is important here and can be used and can be actually become, I mean, I would love to hear some advisors of this government, if they really are in connection, because if you want to thwart these basically efforts, or even to make these efforts valuable and workable, you have to work with local people. Do we have connections with these rebels? Who are our people who talks to them? I mean, the Mistura, I think, did a great job.
Let me put that question to Rachel Sider, because I think that's important. There's three groups, I'll name them, three armed groups, Rachel Sider, in Eastern Ghouta. Jaish al-Islam, Arar al-Sham, and Failaq al-Rahman are their names. We talked about who's got leverage over Bashar al-Assad to stop his side from shooting. Who's got leverage on those three groups to stop them from shooting?
Well, I think if you look at the funds and the resources that are going into Eastern Ghouta over the past few months, what we've seen is that humanitarian aid is only a fraction of that. The bulk of that money and that financing and those resources, which have been contributing to keeping those armed groups active, has been coming from other actors. Now, I don't think we're best placed to, project who those are, but just to say that clearly there is some financing and support that is keeping these groups active, and that is keeping them to be able to resist forces from the outside. That's enabled the population as well to be able to sustain this siege for as long as it has.
General Trinquant, your thoughts?
I think that a lot of these groups are now acting by their own. Of course, they were financed initially by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, or by Turkey. But now they've been fighting for 5 years. They've been in this area. They are the king of this area. We were talking about Yugoslavia. In Sarajevo, it was exactly the same. To control the people when they've been fighting for 4 years in this area, they're making money with help provided by the outsider. So they are the king. And now you ask them, they know, because Bashar al-Assad, with the help of the Russian now, is really going back to be the master, even if we don't like that, in Syria. And they don't want to go back to that. So they want to remain their own leader.
So you're saying no one has leverage over them?
Very, very, very small level.
Actually, who gives them the money usually is the leverage. If you want to understand who transport that money, you choke that money, and through the money you can talk to them. Money talks in these conflicts.
What if it's just shakedown money of the local population?
No, it's not a local population. The money of the local population has dried out a long time ago. However, I just want to remind everybody, from Sydiana, that prison, Bashar al-Assad released the head of one of the groups that you talked about. He used that strategy as a survival strategy to release jihadists so he could be the only viable option for the West, say either me or these jihadists. The truth is we will find ourselves in 20 years' time looking at the same scenario where the majority will basically stand up and demand the same thing: freedom, democracy, and dignity. And we have to come to terms in the West with understanding that these populations want what we want. And we have to understand whatever we do as a solution, a long-term solution, will have to include some kind of an agreement where these people are represented. The majority of the people in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere, they have to have political representation. We're back at this table talking about, in 5 years' time, about the same conflict.
Yeah, that endless cycle, and you could feel a tinge of frustration after the approval of that Security Council resolution from the UN Secretary General himself when he spoke.
Security Council resolutions are only meaningful if they are effectively implemented. And that is why I expect the resolution to be immediately implemented and sustained, particularly to ensure the immediate, safe, unimpeded and sustained delivery of humanitarian aid and services, the evacuation of the critically sick and the wounded, and the alleviation of the suffering of the Syrian people.
Of course, that was on Monday, those remarks, well, it hasn't gone according to plan. Where does that leave the United Nations?
No, but the United Nations is us. I mean, the people around the table have to take a decision. Mr. Guterres is just applying the decision which has been taken by 15 countries. I agree. The problem is that we are talking about the history of the crisis. Of course, Bashar al-Assad will probably win in military terms. The problem is the political end, and we've got no issue. We have been talking in hotel in Geneva, elsewhere, with lots of groups. Never there was an agreement on what will be the future of Syria. And that is the real problem. Because you're right, after Bashar al-Assad is back in power by military terms, what will be the future? The Kurds? These people who don't agree with Bashar al-Assad? And there is no answer for that. So my problem, as I said, is from the start of this crisis, everybody, I mean, on the Western side, didn't want to be involved in the crisis. In Iraq, it's a little bit different because the Americans were there, they were supporting a government, so there was there.
Also Petraeus' vision.
In Syria, no one did anything. So Bashar al-Assad, you're right, took people and say, look, either me or the chaos. And the Russians say, we don't want the chaos, so it will be him.
But in Lebanon, we did something.
There was no opposition
General,
on that.
In Lebanon, we had a civil war that lasted 15 years. We took all the sides and said we will have a power-sharing formula where the Sunni, the Christians, and the Shia will have something. It's not perfect, but it stopped the civil war. But I just want to remind you that the Prime Minister of Lebanon, Hariri, not the current one, but his father, was killed by Bashar al-Assad. So we're talking about somebody that exercised violence even beyond his border. Yeah. So if this guy will stay in power, we will have violence for decades to come, and Europe will have refugees for decades to come. And we will have radicalization. Something else I would like to remind everybody. in Iraq, and I'm happy you mentioned Iraq. General Petraeus, with the help of 2 diplomats, were seasoned diplomats, actually stopped what we call and led the awakening, the Sahwa, in 2009. And you know the formula. It was a political deal and a military deal. And that stopped basically the civil war, and the level of violence went 90% down.
Rachel Sider, let me ask you, because your job is to get involved in the essential, which is getting food and aid that's urgent for civilians. And the numbers, as you mentioned, are staggering. How do you feel when you see a big press coverage of these Geneva talks or Vienna talks or Astana talks? What's your view when you look at that?
You know, I think what we need to remember that we need some type of negotiated political solution to end human suffering in Syria. And it's only going to occur through one of these official UN-led processes. So for us, we remain hopeful that one of these processes will result in a genuine and lasting solution, which will address the rights and uphold the feelings and the beliefs of all of those who've been affected by the crisis, so that we can bring an end to this human suffering. And I think from what we hear from Syrians who we work with on a daily basis, they're looking to the UN for that answer. And if we can't even achieve a full implementation of this UN Security Council resolution, how are we supposed to realize those greater hopes and dreams of the Syrian people?
And when you hear General Tankal saying the only way you're going to get everybody focused around the table is if the international community flexes a little more muscle.
You know, I think from our side, what we'd like to see is just what can we provide in terms of local level solutions to alleviate the day-to-day needs that Syrians have. And that generosity has been demonstrated by international donors, but those types of commitments need to be reverberated in the political sphere. So for us, we're really looking to see how much further the UN and member states can push to bring the parties back around the table and negotiate rather than fight. And for us, what we've seen is time and again the stretching of some of these UN processes and attempts to bring parties to the table with very few results. The stalled UN peace process for us is something that we remain hopeful about, but hope that it will translate to very local level and immediate solutions for those who are on a day-to-day basis trying to meet their most basic humanitarian needs.
All right, and just one final question for you, Rachel. The numbers in that UN resolution are staggering. 2.9 million people in hard-to-reach or besieged locations in Syria. 2.9 million, is that the right figure?
Yes, that's correct. And I think what we need to realize is that while all eyes are focused on Eastern Ghouta, there are several other highly sieged, very high populations of need in other parts of the country in Syria. And violence continues to erupt in a lot of these locations, and that the ceasefire that we're talking about needs to hold not just on Eastern Ghouta, but across the country. And that's a large number of people that would be able to gain some sort of respite and alleviation of human suffering if we're able to reach all of them and lift that siege quite immediately.
Rachel Sider, I want to thank you for joining us from Amman. I want to thank Roula Jabril, General Dominique Tankal. Stay with us, though. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to Emma James.
Hi there. Yes, been taking a look at, of course, this is a real talking point online at the moment, has been for the last week, really, with the hashtag Ghouta, save Ghouta, Ghouta is bleeding. We are seeing it absolutely everywhere. And it is the children of Eastern Ghouta who really seem to be taking centre stage. These two are called Noor and Ala Khatib. They are 10 and 8 years old. And you can see here today they've tweeted 5 hours of ceasefire, but the warplanes are still in the sky. Where is the ceasefire? Now, a lot of people do criticise, really, the use of children. And you can see that in this video, the children are clearly reading the words in English, being held up by somebody off camera. However, without question, the videos that these people do, these children really secure a lot of publicity and a lot of sympathy. Some of them have been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. Women in the World, in fact, has reported on just how widely their message is spreading, and they include one particular tweet which I watched earlier, and it is desperately gut-wrenching because they are screaming in terror and there are people who criticise these things, say that it's fake, but when you listen to that, this is not fake. It is desperately sad to watch. And that was a message that they posted last week just after their home had been bombed, and one of the girls was lightly injured in it. Another youngster who's been tweeting a great deal is Mohammed Najem, a 15-year-old. He says that despite everything that's going wrong, the bombings, the lack of food, he is always smiling. But he has certainly come in for a great deal of controversy and criticism, and it does seem to be very organised, it has to be said. BuzzFeed News among those pointing out that it's pro-Assad and pro-Russia Twitter accounts that are basically smearing him, saying that he's fake. He says he was born and raised in Ghouta, but as you see, there are tweets here saying, you're not real, I hope the Syrian army wins this war and the United States go home because they build wars worldwide, and that's from a Russian account. And this one too saying, it looks and smells like a CIA operation. Frankly, this kid looks too preppy to be some Syrian kid. Now, there is a very, very organised feel to all of this, and you'll remember that it's happened before too. BARNEY
Aleppo. Yes.
Absolutely. She's tweeted today, will Syria be like this forever? She is still active online. Obviously, some questions raised over the fact that that 15-year-old only opened his Twitter account in December, which has made some people a little suspicious. However, the Russian narrative is very, very different to what we see everywhere else. Most people seem to believe that these people in Eastern Ghouta are victims. They are civilians trapped in what Antonio Guterres called hell on earth. But for the Russians, they're rebels, terrorists, or even militants. And here on Sputnik today, they're writing articles about the fact that it is the militants, as they call them, the people who are in Ghouta, who are actually breaking the ceasefire, and that the Syrian army is exercising great restraint by not responding to that. If you want some very balanced and very moving and very graphic information about what life is like on the ground, this is a very interesting blog from Agence France Presse. It is a photographer by the name of Abdelmonem Issa, who says that the things I have witnessed here I will never forget if I remain alive. Incredibly strong stuff. He talks about the fact that he is constantly faced with the question, should I help or should I take the photographs? Of course, it's his job to highlight the reality of what's going on in Syria, but he talks about the child with the outstretched hand that's in one of these photographs is actually the child of a friend, and how difficult it was for him to actually get the child to release his hand so that he could take the photograph that he needed to do. It's not just images, though, that are very strong. There are some very strong words out there, too. This article in The Atlantic is well worth a look, written by Evelyn Farkas. Russia is abetting mass murder in Syria, she says. Now, she's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She also used to be, she served in the Barack Obama administration. And what she says is that the US needs to enforce the ceasefire in Eastern Ghouta by threatening force and, if necessary, using it. She says that by standing by and watching a slow-motion Rwanda unfold, the US risks becoming an accessory to evil. And one last word on this, a British MP also employing some very, very strong words to his colleagues in the Houses of Parliament, saying that the children who died in that chlorine gas attack, their bodies should be brought into the chambers of every government that is sitting back and doing nothing.
Emma James, many thanks. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.
Thank you.